Okay, thanks everybody, and glad we were able to sort the technical difficulties out. I figured, John, that people would challenge me on this. So I intended for it to be intentionally provocative, but slightly playful by using my favorite Silver Jews lyric or fragment of it in the title here. So my talk is not about what is just or what is moral in history. I'm not going to try to do that or weigh in on that. It's more about how to incite a questioning after morality and social justice in the 100-level history lecture. How to get students to apply moral reasoning of right and wrong in their understanding of the past, to empower them to take positions on the past. I think this is a challenge. It's a difficult thing to do. How do you say what's good and what's bad in what happened in history? That's not usually what history teachers or history writers are about. So, to empower them to take positions on the past, to build on the typical historical questions of the what, the how, the why, and the consequences of history by asking a couple of extra questions. What should have happened if the world were just? And beyond that, what are the historical preconditions, the events that must happen to have justice in specific areas of social life in the future? What kind of politics is needed to steer us onto this course of history? Okay, so I think this is a challenge for historians. For all, I think, moral questions and all questions to do with justice, in fact, they come from a position in which truth's reference point is outside the world as we know it, or at least outside the world as historians can know it. We always have to imagine a truth beyond our world, a sort of end to the story before we can think about the plot and think about the moral of the story. So I think maybe some of you, this is a really small fragment from Saul of Tarsus, aka the Apostle Paul, in the 1st century AD, in his first letter to the Corinthians. I think most people, if you recognize this verse, you recognize it as the final thought of Paul's musings in his epistle on love or charity. And so I'll just read it to you. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known. So there's a lot of different ways you can interpret this primary source from the 1st century AD. I think that first of all, it's something that later poets, thinking about God and trying to describe this awesome thing, God, even though confessing to know him or to know her, they have a difficulty describing it. And I think Paul is expressing that difficulty in describing the divine. I think there's also a way that you can see a verse like this is just meditating on that classic epistemological problem of how we know certain knowledge. How can we be sure of things? How can we know that we really know them? But I, being an historian, whenever I remember this verse, which was ingrained in my memory as a child, whenever I think of it today, I think of it as having something to do with the philosophy of history, right? And here is, I think, the paradox for historians. There is a fundamental problem that we have. We're storytellers. But the true meaning of history, like any story, really only comes clear in the end. And yet, for historians, the end of the story is the future. So how do you tell a story? How do you implot it? How do you give a moral to your story when you don't know what's coming next, when you haven't yet been able to complete that vision and see how the future unfolds? You have no end to it. Is it even possible to tell a story that has a moral? Can you tell a story with a moral when the story is unfinished? Okay, so the question then is, how do you do this? And now I've put out the philosophical conundrum, the paradox as I see it for historians, and now the rest of my talk is going to be sort of specific thoughts for how historians and others might deal with this problem and think about how to introduce and incite moral questions and questions about social justice in spite of this paradox facing historians. And so I always turn to one of my favorite writers of all time, the person for me, I was 18 years old when I picked up Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. And I don't know if any of you have ever read this book before, but it really is this impressive study in some of the most awesome of all moral dilemmas facing us in the modern era. And I wasn't going to go to college. I was 19 years old. I had taken a couple of years off after graduating, and I picked up this book, The Brothers Karamazov, and it just lit a fire somehow in my mind. I decided actually through reading these thick annotations at the end of the book that there's so much meaning in the study of history, in the study of all the ideas and all the range of social experience that goes in to these ponderous, weighty meditations on morality and justice that Dostoevsky was obsessed with. I think he did it just about better than anybody else. He was constantly plagued by demons. So this contemporary illustration of Dostoevsky from a literary journal in Russia shows the power of Dostoevsky, I think, as a cultural icon, but it also shows him as a kind of maybe slightly mad visionary, somebody who's always seeing the haunts of life. And I want to argue that it's that kind of experience, that psychic experience that Dostoevsky has, that allows him to speak from a moral vantage point, that allows him to in a sense, move his mind, move his vision outside the world, and to be able to think about the meaning of all things, and to create a sort of total vision of all of history, to weigh in on questions of what is right and what is wrong, what is just. He grew up a Christian. He then became an historical materialist, an atheist. Later in life, after nearly being executed by the firing squad and spared just minutes before the guns went off, Dostoevsky converts back to Christianity, and he spends much of his life trying to grapple with these really heavy issues of the time, of the later 19th century. Revolution, rebellion, or religion. What do we do with industrial conflict? What do we do with the transformations in the social experience of life? How can we deal with displacement, dispossession, and injustice that's so palpable in our time? Dostoevsky dared to doubt, but he never stopped asking this big question: what does it all mean? And I put italics there for all. What does it all? What is the total vision of history? So how can lectures about particular histories, this is my big pedagogical question, how can lectures in the 100 level that are always about particular histories, whether it's Western Canada, whether it's a making of modern Europe, a making of the British Isles, particular histories, how can they question what does it all mean? How can you fit particular stories into a total vision of history and then gain that vista, that vantage point on morality and social justice, or at least invite your students to do so? How can a history lecture seek this vantage point that envisions its end and the moral of the story? So here's one idea that I've been working with, and I've got three, and then I want to illustrate some of this for you. But first, explore how people asked that question in the past. So there is no final answer to it, and I think that it's important that we as historians take a position and model that kind of analysis of history for our students. We know what's right, we know what's wrong, we have a sense of justice, and we should be bold enough to say what's right and what's wrong. But it's really, I think, effective to incite your students, to encourage them to try to see how people in the past have asked this question over and over and over again as sort of the keynote maybe of all of history. What is it all about? What does it all mean? What's the point of it all? And do this kind of questioning in the past through in-class close reading. So taking time out in class to read through a text. And my argument is that we need to model a relationship to words from the past that treats them not as information to be processed, and this goes very much against the grain of the death by PowerPoint kind of lecture. Not to treat words as information to be taken in, memorized, and processed as if our brains are machines, but rather to think about words as something kind of enchanted, rather as keys to unlock mystery and meaning. We need to take the time to reveal a text's epiphany. This is a concept from Thomas Aquinas that's been used a lot by many, many poets. Literary modernisms make a lot of use of this. James Joyce thought a lot about epiphanies. But the idea here is to think of things as having a kind of essence and meaning in and of themselves, that shine even if we can't see them. The object is to reveal their meaning. And it takes time to do that. Okay, second idea. I might have to walk over. No, here we go. Number two, explore stories of people at the extremes of the human life cycle. So if the object is to try to get a kind of bird's eye view of all of history, we need to think about those moments and spend a lot of time in the lecture and creating spaces in which we're meditating and focusing on the entrance and the exit points of life. In other words, the experience of being. So focus on the extremes of the human life cycle, childhood and death, entering and exiting the world. Break down the continuum of history that sees the progression of cause, event, and consequence. Break this down by using a technique that I think was really mastered by William Blake at the end of the 18th century, that David Erdman, the literary historian, called organized innocence, juxtaposing imagery of innocence and childhood with the stark reality of human experience. And doing that invites a kind of questioning, I think, for us and for our students. And use dialectical imagery, stark oppositions, to get people to see that there is a sort of conflict that they need to resolve and that it's incumbent on them to process and to think through. And then the third thing, make the lecture a phantasmagoria show, okay? And so here's an illustration of a phantasmagoria show from the end of the 18th century. And you have, I think, this, you see somebody, whether this is a lantern or a limelight projector here, they've created this phantasmagoric experience for an audience where the audience feels, when they witness it, when they're a part of it, that they're having the eternal aspects, the sort of eternal side of life move into their material world, into their space, and confront them. And if we're going to do this and use PowerPoint, rather than giving us all these bullet points and death by PowerPoint and so on, we need to think about what kinds of historical demons we can put in the pathway of our students. And that, to me, to do that and to have some intentionality about it, to really think about these images that can arrest and jar you out of sort of the routine and really make you reckon with a reality that was unknown to you before. I think those are crucial to inject into 100-level lectures especially. So I want to try to show you how this can be done and fold all these three principles into a single. This is from my History 106 class, and this is one way in which I do this kind of in-class close reading, also the use of dialectical imagery and the meditation on, and through a sort of phantasmagoria, meditation on these extreme points of life and of death. I think one of the best comments I ever got from a student in evaluation, the student said, well, we kind of like Wendell's lectures, but he has a really strange and bizarre fascination with death. And I thought, okay, at least I'm doing, maybe the point wasn't there, but it was noticed. And I think that's fair enough, that's good enough for me, that students recognize that when they come into a lecture and we talk about late modernity, that they're in a space in which we're going to see a lot of shocking images. We're going to see a lot and we're going to think about death. So here, back to Dostoevsky. Here's how Dostoevsky uses his character, Ivan, in The Brothers Karamazov, to pick up this question of total morality and the meaning of history. And Dostoevsky, I'm borrowing from him because he really, for me, he innovated this method of using imagery of children and using it in a way that can kind of, I hope, jar. So Ivan makes this argument. He is thinking about ideology and especially continental European ideologies of the late 19th century, these utopian ideals that are going to build a new society from the grassroots, from the ground up. And he's worried about the cost, the human costs of these experiments in utopian dreaming and the materializing of utopian plans. And he says to his brother, Alyosha, he says, listen, and he's just told him this long story about how awful it is that so many children have died, so many innocent people have been sacrificed to the processes of industrialization, of zealotry, of religion, and so on. Listen, I took the case of children not only to make the case clearer of the other tiers of humanity with which the earth is soaked from its crust to its center, I will say nothing. I have narrowed my subject on purpose. And so the way that I lay this out in class is to always let the viewers know that there's something else to come, but that every sentence of a close reading of a text, we're going to spend time on it. We're going to give it the biblical treatment, so to speak. Think of it as verses. Any words from the past deserve to be treated as if they're scripture. So we spend time on each line. I am a bug, says Yvonne, and I recognize in all humility that I cannot understand why the world is arranged as it is. Men are themselves to blame, I suppose. They were given paradise, they wanted freedom, and stole fire from heaven, though they knew they would become unhappy, so there is no need to pity them. And then I think that Yvonne really starts to put his finger on the problem of telling history and of taking positions, moral positions, and positions on social justice when thinking historically. He says, with my pitiful, earthly, Euclidean understanding, and now isn't this the thought system that dominates the post-Enlightenment university? The way that we understand knowledge is as process, as mechanical, event leading on to event, and causes leading on to consequences. He says, with my pitiful, earthly, Euclidean understanding, all I know is that there is suffering and that there are none guilty. Suffering, none are guilty. That cause follows effect, simply and directly, that everything flows and finds its level. But that's only Euclidean nonsense. I know that, and I can't consent to live by it. What comfort is it to me that there are none guilty and that cause follows effect simply and directly, and that I know it? And then he has this powerful concluding thought. He says, I must have justice. I must have justice or I will destroy myself. And not justice in some remote infinite time and space, but here on earth, and that I could see myself. And if the sufferings of children go to swell the sum of sufferings which was necessary to pay for truth, then I protest that the truth is not worth such a price. And of course, through this entire thing, at the bottom of the slide, we have an image. Can anybody guess what it is? It's an image of children during the Blitzkrieg in Britain, cowering under a table to try to avoid the bombs that are put there by ideology, put there by modern ideologies that have a plan, that have a purpose, that have a history, right? And they're willing to give us a total vision of history. We need to also be able to take those ideologies, I think, apart with dialectical imagery that works in the opposite direction. So this picture here, this image, this is, of course, Alan Kurdi, or an artistic depiction, a cartoon depiction of the Syrian boy who drowned just earlier this month, trying to get out of Syria and into Europe. This is from my Making of Modern Europe class, and Europe, of course, on the periphery, or Turkey, of course, on the periphery of Europe, a gateway for people fleeing and trying to get into Europe today. And I think that it's powerful for students to ask them to think about the work that adult politics does to the lives of children, right? And to make them think about that, and to then point out when they see a picture like this, and of course it conjures the outside of the world. It conjures that reference point for truth as an angel scoops up the body of Alan here and lifts him up to heaven. He says, I hope humanity finds a cure for visas, okay? I hope humanity finds a cure for visas. And then to point out to the students that what are the ideologies, what are the plans, what are the systems of history, the understanding of total history that produce things like this and that sort of go, sort of are left without being challenged. And one of them is, of course, the nation, right? This is the legacy of European nationalism. This is the legacy of what was essentially, at the end of the 18th and early 19th century, a powerful and emancipatory vision of building a new social order, toppling monarchies, toppling aristocracies, having this vehicle, the nation, through which we can express the spirit of the age and a sort of emancipatory ideal that can bring freedom to people. And yet the nation here has, over time, created borders, created structures of control for who can be in, who can be out. And to me, this is where that ideology, that's where it culminates. So if it does anything, it incites a questioning. It doesn't close things off. It doesn't pontificate and tell them how it should be. I have my own preference. And by the end, I think they get it. They see how I see the sort of longue durée of these ideological transformations and social transformations in Europe. But if anything, it invites them to challenge. It invites them to question and to think about morality and social justice by trying to take a bird's eye view of what the total past has been, of what total history has been. Maybe if it incites a moral questioning after the point of this, after the point of borders, maybe the next thing is a conclusion, that maybe it's the border that should be illegal instead of the illegal people as we label them today. And if they're able to get there, maybe they're able to generate a politics that can challenge this sort of thing. Thanks.